I arrived at the televised anniversary gala for Veil Foundation wearing the calm expression that had protected me for years. I had chosen the silver dress Evelyn's staff preferred, smiled at donors who knew me only as the dependable daughter in the background, and reminded myself that usefulness was still a kind of belonging if I said it often enough. Then the lights dimmed, the documentary began, and the first line of the narrator's script split me open in front of 500 people at my father's televised foundation gala. A new family documentary credited another woman with the program I built. Then my name vanished from the donor wall while the guests watched. The screen filled with the first school visits, the folding tables, the whiteboard maps, the cramped community rooms, the handwritten planning boards I had made with blue marker after midnight. But the woman on stage being praised as the visionary who had built the outreach program from nothing was Sabrina Holt, smiling in a designer sheath dress, while a ballroom full of donors applauded a lie polished to broadcast quality. I did not move when the wall went dark. That was the part everyone remembered later, because stillness can look like grace to people who have never felt themselves being erased in public. A staff member stepped to the illuminated donor wall beside the screen and, with the smooth ease of rehearsal, deactivated the brass plate that carried my name. The panel dimmed. Guests turned toward the wall, then toward me, trying to decide whether they had just witnessed a clerical correction or a family execution. Theo looked down at his champagne glass instead of at my face. Across the room, Evelyn accepted congratulations with the serene authority of a woman who believed history belonged to whoever had the better lighting. In that instant, two questions took hold of the room and of me. Why had my family chosen to remove me in public instead of in private? And what truth were they so afraid of that humiliation had become safer than conversation? The insult did not end with the screening. After the speeches, Evelyn summoned me into the private dining room where the inner circle had already taken their seats. Crystal reflected the chandelier light. Every place card had been arranged. Every witness had been chosen. She waited until the door closed, then looked at me as if I were a difficult detail in an otherwise successful evening. "Mara, you were never meant to speak for this family," she said, not loudly, but with the confidence of a woman who expected silence to do half her work for her. She framed the evening as a course correction. She said the foundation needed a cleaner public story before the donor campaign expanded. She implied that gratitude should make humiliation easier to swallow. When I asked why my name had been removed instead of discussed, she answered that discussion was what weak families did in front of donors. Theo said nothing. He sat there in his tuxedo and expensive watch, eyes fixed on the stem of his glass, while I understood that the evening had been engineered long before I walked into it. I could have screamed. I could have thrown a glass. I could have given them the scene they had already prepared to dismiss as instability. Instead, I looked from Evelyn to Theo, saw fear where I had hoped to find shame, and understood the shape of the machine around me. Someone had recut the documentary. Someone had ordered the donor wall changed. Someone had chosen a room full of witnesses so that every future appeal for mercy would sound smaller than the applause they had already staged. Then one stubborn memory rose above the shock. The storage case in my apartment still held the original field journals and donor letters that proved who created the program, preserved because I had never trusted the family to value the years before the cameras arrived. I left the dining room with metal in my mouth, humiliation under my skin, and one terrible new certainty. If they had built an entire spectacle to erase me, then the proof I carried mattered far more than I had let myself believe. Long before the gala, before the donor wall, before the polished documentaries and foundation theaters and velvet-roped anniversary speeches, I was the woman driving a borrowed van to schools no sponsor wanted to visit. I wrote the first outreach plans by hand. I built the first route maps with sticky notes and a ruler. I sat at kitchen tables with mothers who did not care about philanthropic language and only wanted to know whether someone would actually come back next week. My father loved to say the family believed in service, but what he really loved were outcomes that could be photographed and retold by people with good tailoring. Evelyn loved polish. Theo loved stages. I loved the work itself, and that made me the easiest person to hide once the work started succeeding. When the program was fragile, my obsession looked useful. When it became valuable, the same obsession made me inconvenient because it tied the story to a woman who remembered exactly how everything began. At first, invisibility felt temporary. The family told me the public role would come later, after the foundation stabilized, after the donors grew comfortable, after the press cycle softened, after Theo learned how to handle a microphone without sounding entitled. Later became a private joke. I told myself whenever another brochure quoted my strategy notes without naming me, whenever another gala seated me at the table, but introduced me as reliable family support, whenever another board deck flattened 10 years of labor into a brand narrative tidy enough for television. I stayed because the program mattered to girls who had started planning their weeks around our visits. I stayed because leaving felt like abandoning people who had done nothing to me. I stayed because families teach women to call endurance loyalty until the day endurance becomes evidence against them. By the time I understood how thoroughly I had been trained into silence, my silence had already become one of the foundation's most profitable assets. The first crack in the official story opened months before the gala. A donor from the earliest program, year, sent me a note asking why the new annual report credited strategy development to a consultancy that had not existed when the pilot launched. I raised the discrepancy gently, the way daughters learn to raise anything that might embarrass people with inheritance and donor influence. Evelyn answered with the polished irritation she reserved for inconvenient truths. The report was being modernized, she said. The program had grown beyond its amateur phase. Personal attachment to early drafts was natural but childish. I let the matter drop in public, but privately I started paying attention to the edits that had once looked harmless, missing names and captions, revised timelines, staff talking points that smoothed out the messy first years into something elegant enough to belong to people who had not carried folding chairs into school basements. The closer the foundation moved toward prestige, the more aggressively it seemed to sand my fingerprints off the origin story. After the gala, I returned to my apartment and pulled the old canvas case from the back of a closet. Inside were the notebooks I had kept during the first year, donor letters written before the family employed communications teams, route maps, expense logs, and printed emails from nights when I had begged the family office to cover fuel because the schools could not wait another month. The pages smelled faintly of dust and toner. The handwriting was messier than I remembered. None of it looked glamorous enough for a documentary, and that was exactly why it mattered. Real beginnings rarely look cinematic. They look improvised, tired, underfunded, and painfully specific. I sat on the floor with those journals around me and felt the humiliation in my body change shape. It was still pain, but it became usable pain, the kind that forces a woman to stop negotiating with people who have already decided what her place is supposed to be. At dawn, my phone lit up with a message from Lydia Chin, the operations director, who had watched me build the outreach program from its first school visit. Lydia never wasted words. She warned me that someone from the family office had entered the digital archive after midnight and requested the earliest program files under a board review pretext. Another request had gone to facilities asking for access logs near the donor wall. None of that sounded like a family regretting an overreaction. It sounded like a family checking for leaks, sealing records, and making sure every witness understood which version of events would be rewarded. Lydia ended her message with one line that settled my thoughts into something colder than panic. If they are still cleaning, it means they know you have something they can't predict. That was the moment I stopped asking whether the gala had gone too far and started asking what my family was frightened enough to erase me for. I spent that afternoon replaying old memories I had spent years calling strategic decisions. In the program's second year, a television producer had wanted to interview me on site after a visit to a school gymnasium. Evelyn had stepped in smiling, thanked the producer for supporting the cause, and explained that the family preferred to keep operational staff away from the public narrative while the brand matured. At the time, I believed her. I believed the family was protecting the program. I believed recognition delayed was still recognition. Standing in my apartment with the journals on the floor, I saw the truth more clearly. The family had not decided to erase me overnight. They had rehearsed my disappearance for years, reducing my visibility every time the work became too valuable to leave attached to the woman who had actually done it. The gala was simply the first time the rehearsal became impossible for outsiders to miss. What hurt most was not the thought of losing credit. IT was remembering the girls who had learned to look for me first whenever the van pulled into a school courtyard. They called me by name, not by foundation title. They trusted me because I returned calls, remembered siblings, and never treated their lives like props for fundraising dinners. That memory clarified something important. The family had not only stolen authorship from me, it had tried to convert care into brand equity, turning real labor and real loyalty into a polished inheritance asset. Once I named that theft correctly, my purpose sharpened. I was not fighting for a corrected caption. I was not fighting for a line in a documentary. I was fighting the old family habit of consuming a woman's usefulness and then presenting the remains as collective virtue. That fight was uglier than a dispute over credit, but it was also cleaner. Once I understood what was actually being taken, I stopped confusing reconciliation with justice. The next 2 days taught me how coordinated the defense already was. Files disappeared from shared drives. Staff who had once answered me within minutes suddenly wrote back with warm vagueness and no information at all. Invitations to planning meetings went out without my name. Even people who cared about me spoke, as if they were being overheard. But each act of pressure revealed the structure of the lie more clearly. Truth does not require synchronized silence. Truth does not need half the office pretending not to remember who built the pilot year. Truth does not move a woman off every agenda before dawn. Every softened email and every locked door confirmed that Evelyn feared proof more than scandal. It also forced me to accept something I had resisted for years. If I kept waiting for my family to behave honorably on its own, the lie would harden faster than memory. Lydia met me after hours in a parking garage because the office no longer felt safe. From a tote bag, she produced copies of metadata from the documentary edit history showing that the earliest rough cut named me in captions and voiceover until a final night revision replaced me with Sabrina Holt. There were also internal comments from communications staff asking whether the donor wall could be aligned to final messaging before broadcast. Lydia apologized for not speaking sooner. I told her apology was wasted energy. What mattered was that the family had made a series of decisions, not a single emotional mistake. Decisions leave trails. Trails leave openings. For the first time since the gala, the betrayal looked less like a storm cloud over my life and more like a machine assembled by human hands. Machines can be exposed. They can be interrupted. They can be made visible to people who once believed the polished version because nobody had shown them the wiring. I spent the following morning revisiting early donors one by one, not to ask for rescue, but to test memory against the official narrative. An elderly pediatrician named Miriam Voss welcomed me into a sunlit townhouse kitchen and pulled out a framed photograph from the pilot year. There I was, hair tied back, whiteboard marker in hand, explaining the first outreach map to a room full of skeptical adults. There was no Sabrina, no board consultant, no launch strategist imported for television. Dr. Voss remembered exactly why she had funded the first van, because the young woman in front of her had known every family by name and every obstacle by cost. When she said, "I invested because I believed you, not because I believed your surname," the sentence landed with the force of permission I had not realized I still craved. My family had trained me to treat witnesses as ornamental, but there is real power in hearing another person say out loud that your memory is not vanity. It is record. Evelyn answered those donor visits with a second counterattack. At the donor strategy luncheon 3 days after the gala, the board was told that outside consultants had modernized the outreach arm after an informal family phase became unsustainable. Theo repeated the line smoothly enough that most attendees might have accepted it if they had not already heard from me or seen Lydia's documents. Worse, the family announced a new scholarship in honor of founding women of the foundation, a phrase broad enough to sound generous and empty enough to exclude me by design. Watching the live stream from my apartment, I felt humiliation trying to become self-doubt again. My family was excellent at building ceremonies that made erasure sound noble. If I let the performance continue uncontested, even honest witnesses would eventually start wondering whether memory itself had become rude. That was the real damage of dynastic lies. They do not only alter record, they make the truth feel socially inappropriate. That night, Theo came to my apartment without warning. He looked less like an heir and more like a man who had spent 2 days pretending not to hear his conscience. He told me my mother was preparing a private settlement, a restored salary, a ceremonial title, perhaps even a quiet board acknowledgement at year end. If only I would stop speaking to donors and release Lydia from any obligation to cooperate. The offer was almost tender in its calculation. It assumed that money, proximity, and the possibility of eventual recognition would still be enough to buy my patience. I let him talk until he ran out of rehearsed mercy, then asked the only question that mattered. If the truth helped the family, why was every proposed solution built around my silence? His face hardened immediately. He accused me of threatening the very program I claimed to love. He said donors hated mess. He said teenagers needed stability. He said public institutions could not survive family wars. For one disorienting second, my old instincts rose up. I nearly reassured him. I nearly explained myself smaller, so he would not feel accused. Then I saw the trap clearly. The family harmed me first, and then drafted me into protecting them from the discomfort of knowing it. I told Theo the program deserved better than a mythology maintained by deleting the woman who built its earliest spine. Once I stopped negotiating with him, emotionally, the pattern got uglier fast. Board minutes had been amended after the fact. Early grant proposals referenced my field reports without naming the author. A celebratory magazine profile had lifted whole descriptions from donor letters I wrote during the pilot year and placed them into the mouth of a consultant who had not joined the orbit until years later. None of those pieces alone would have toppled the family story. Together, they revealed a habit. And habits are what powerful families call culture when they do not want to call it theft. I did not merely have proof that my name had been removed from a wall. I had proof that my family had spent years training the public to accept my disappearance as natural. The revelation should have been clarifying, but some nights it just felt exhausting. There is a particular kind of fatigue that comes from realizing the wound is older and more organized than you wanted to believe. One of the most useful pieces came from a former documentary editor who had already left the foundation and no longer depended on my family for work. He agreed to meet only after Lydia vouched for me, and even then kept checking the cafe window like a man who had once learned how expensive honesty could become. He told me the original cut had been built around my field footage and my voice notes because those were the most emotionally credible materials in the archive. The order to remove me had come late after a closed-door review led by Evelyn. He remembered the exact phrase because it had bothered him. The audience must feel dynasty, not dependency. When I heard it, everything aligned. My family had never seen me as a founder whose work gave the brand substance. They saw me as embarrassing proof that substance had existed before their preferred spokesperson. That was why the gala had to be so public. If the family could teach the room to look at someone else while my own record played behind her, maybe it could teach the future to do the same. The pressure campaign escalated again the next morning. My landlord, who had always been friendly in a cautious way, called to say the property owner intended to reassess the lease because the apartment had become linked to an emerging public controversy. The message was polite enough to sound almost neutral, but the source was obvious. My family could not control the journals in my closet, so it reached for the ground beneath my feet. For half an hour, panic nearly broke my concentration. Then Dr. Voss called back with 2 spare rooms above her carriage house and a single practical instruction: bring the boxes first. Pride can arrive later. That offer saved more than my logistics, carrying the archive case down the stairs. I realized how often I had mistaken proximity for security. The family had given me access badges, invitations, and rooms inside buildings with our name carved in stone, and I had let those things persuade me I belonged. But the first time I endangered their preferred story, every borrowed doorway narrowed. Standing in Dr. Voss's guest room with banker boxes, notebooks, route maps, and old donor letters around me, I finally saw what was actually mine: my memory, my work, my records, my voice, and the few people who had chosen me without asking the dynasty for permission. The turning point came when Lydia obtained the internal run sheet for the emergency donor briefing being held in Vale Foundation's small theater. My family planned to use it to calm concern after whispers about the gala and the restructuring. Cameras would be limited, but the room would contain everyone whose opinion mattered: board members, legacy donors, sponsors, and the senior staff who had quietly watched the revision of history. Evelyn intended to use the gathering to stabilize the narrative once and for all. To me, it looked like something else. It looked like the first stage they had built for themselves without understanding it could be taken. I did not need to shout my truth into a hostile ballroom. I needed to walk into a room prepared for reassurance and make reassurance impossible. Once I saw that, my fear simplified into resolve. I was no longer trying to win my old place back. I no longer wanted a corrected caption, amended introduction, or a seat restored through family pity. I wanted the architecture of the lie exposed so thoroughly that no future version could be built on top of it. The morning of the briefing, I spread everything across the dining table in Dr. Voss's guest suite and built the presentation my family had spent years preventing. I arranged the journals chronologically, clipped donor letters beside matching grant language, printed the documentary edit history, and marked the exact moment my name vanished from the final cut. I was not assembling evidence for a courtroom. I was assembling a story strong enough to survive a polished interruption. Every page had to answer a likely tactic: denial, minimization, pity, deflection, accusation. I also chose my witnesses carefully. Dr. Voss agreed to attend and bring the original pledge card from the pilot year. Lydia prepared to confirm the edit history if challenged. A retired program coordinator who had kept hard copy schedules from the first school visits offered to verify dates and locations. None of them were there to rescue me. That distinction mattered. For years, my family had treated my credibility as something that existed only when endorsed by a higher-ranking voice. This time, the witnesses were not a substitute for my authority. They were a structure around it. Proof that truth becomes harder to bury when a woman stops carrying it alone. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn made one last attempt to contain me. A black car arrived with a handwritten note inviting me to a private conversation before the briefing. The note promised dignity, healing, and an opportunity to avoid irreversible harm. I understood every word as a translation of the same old command: keep the wound private, so the family can remain public. I did not go. I sent back one sentence instead: if there is dignity available tonight, it will not come from silence. The simplicity steadied me. When I entered the theater, I felt the room take inventory of me. Some faces showed relief that I had come at all. Others showed the alert discomfort reserved for women who might ruin an orderly evening by telling the truth too clearly. Theo approached first and whispered that our mother would allow a brief personal acknowledgement if I behaved. He still believed recognition was something the family could distribute like a favor. I told him I had not come to be allowed anything. I had come to finish a sentence the family had tried to cut out of its own history. Evelyn opened the briefing with the same velvet authority she had used for years. She thanked donors for their patience, praised the foundation's resilience, and framed recent confusion as the predictable noise surrounding change. Then she invited Sabrina Holt to the stage as an example of fresh stewardship rooted in the founding vision. The wording was brilliant in a bloodless way. It gestured toward continuity while burying the person whose continuity made the claim possible. The room might have accepted it if I had stayed seated. Instead, I rose before the applause finished and asked for one factual correction before the foundation committed another permanent one. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the dining room after the gala. That earlier silence had been arranged against me. This one arrived because no one knew whether to stop me, and because too many people already suspected the official version was thinner than it sounded. I walked to the front row, lifted the first journal high enough for donors to see its bent spine and dated pages, and said that before anyone discussed stewardship, the room needed to know who had actually built the thing being inherited. I opened the journal to the first route planning spread, the one I had filled in while sitting on the floor of my old apartment because I could not afford a proper desk yet. I read the names of 3 schools that had taken a chance on us before the foundation had a camera crew, before the family had a polished slogan, before anyone in the room thought the pilot year would become a legacy story worth owning. Then I held up one donor letter after another and matched the dates to the journal entries, showing how the same language now featured in the Foundation's glossy materials had first appeared in my handwriting, in my updates, in my budget requests, in the midnight notes I sent when the van needed repairs, and the girls still expected us the next morning. I did it slowly on purpose. Powerful families survive by making truth sound emotional and their edits sound procedural. I wanted every person in that theater to feel the order of events settle into place so clearly that nobody could later pretend the confusion had been mutual. From there, momentum became moral rather than theatrical. I did not rant. I narrated. I showed the pilot year route maps, read from the earliest donor letters, and matched those documents to later brochures that had stripped me out sentence by sentence. Lydia confirmed the documentary edits. Dr. Voss confirmed the original pledge and why it had been given. The retired coordinator confirmed the first school calendar. Each witness widened the space in which truth could breathe. When Theo tried to say that many people had contributed, I answered that contribution was not the same as replacement. Then I said the thing that changed the room. I told them the family had not merely taken credit. It had counted on my love to keep the theft quiet. It had depended on the fact that daughters are trained to absorb injury rather than expose it, especially when exposure might embarrass men, donors, or the family crest above the door. Suddenly, the briefing was no longer only about archival accuracy. It was about the old bargain wealthy families offer women. Give us your labor, your discretion, your emotional management. And in return, we will let you remain near the table we still control. Several women in the audience lowered their eyes when I said it, not out of discomfort, but recognition. Once that recognition entered the room, Evelyn's abstractions began to collapse under their own polish. Sabrina stood just behind Evelyn's shoulder the whole time, hands clasped too tightly, smile failing by degrees. Until that moment, I had almost treated her as the central betrayal because her face was the one on the screen. Looking at her there, I understood something sharper. She was not the architect. She was the acceptable replacement, the polished vessel my family had selected because she could carry prestige without carrying inconvenient memory. That realization steadied me in an unexpected way. I stopped speaking to the room as if I were pleading against a personal rival and started speaking as a woman describing a system. I said plainly that this was how public erasure worked in families like mine. First, they borrow your labor while the work is risky, then they rename it when it becomes valuable, then they call you divisive for noticing. A murmur moved through the theater at that, low and immediate, because everyone understood I was no longer describing one ugly week. I was describing a pattern, and patterns are much harder to excuse than accidents. The questions that followed did more damage to my family than anything I could have scripted myself. A board member who had barely spoken all evening asked why no one had thought to ask my permission before using my notes, language, and images in materials that now carried someone else's name. Another asked why the donor wall had been changed before the briefing, if this was really just a misunderstanding. Someone else wanted to know who authorized the documentary revision. Donors were no longer looking to Evelyn for cues. Staff members who had spent the week avoiding I were watching openly now, some with shame, some with relief. For the first time in years, I was no longer defending my own memory against a machine built to overrule it. The room itself was doing some of the work. The hierarchy that had once made me small now made the exposure harder to contain, because when powerful people fail in public, they do not only lose narrative control, they lose timing, rhythm, and the illusion that everyone else is still willing to confuse refinement with innocence. Theo broke before Evelyn did. He admitted that he had known the donor wall would be changed, though he claimed he had not expected it to happen so harshly. He admitted that he had asked me to sign the statement. He admitted, in a voice too low for heroism and too audible for escape, that the family had believed I would choose loyalty over exposure because I always had before. It was not a noble confession. It was late, partial, and shaped to leave him somewhere to stand. But it was enough. I did not need him to become brave. I needed the room to hear that the plan had been deliberate and that my silence had been assumed as part of the architecture. Evelyn made her final move with extraordinary discipline. She rose, thanked me for sharing my feelings, and tried to absorb the entire exposure into a softer story about misunderstood roles inside a growing institution. But the documents on the table had already outrun the language of misunderstanding. A donor asked why a woman who had supposedly been valued was publicly erased instead of privately thanked. Another asked why the family's first response had been gossip about my health. The theater was no longer a place where performance could outrank sequence. It had become a room full of adults watching power fail to explain itself. Then came the apology Evelyn had been saving for a safer audience. She offered it with elegant sorrow, speaking of family strain, heavy responsibilities, and the pain of seeing private conflict spill into public view. She said the foundation would be happy to restore my title, review the documentary, and discuss an internal acknowledgement of my early work. Every phrase was designed to return the power of naming to the same hands that had abused it. I understood immediately that accepting her offer would allow the dynasty to present the evening as a difficult but resolved misunderstanding. It would give them back the right to decide how much of me they were willing to see. So I refused gently and in full view of everyone. I said I was not there to negotiate re-entry into a story that had required my disappearance in order to function. I said the program should continue, but it would continue without my silence. I said the journals, letters, and early plans would be archived independently so that no future campaign could rewrite the beginning again. Finally, I said that recognition meant nothing if it arrived only after exposure made denial inconvenient. The boundary landed harder than anger would have. Rage can be dismissed as volatility. A calm woman declining the terms of her own restoration is much more difficult for a powerful family to survive. When the briefing ended, people did not rush first to Evelyn. They crossed the room toward me. Some came to apologize for what they had chosen not to see. Some came with questions about the records. Some came simply to stand near the truth now that it had a public shape. Lydia squeezed my hand once and said, "They cannot put you back in the wall now." That absurd, perfect sentence made me laugh for the first time in days. The laugh felt foreign and clean. It did not heal everything my family had taken, but it proved that the wound no longer dictated the entire future. The operational consequences began before I even reached the lobby. Two donors quietly informed the board chair that any future campaign would require an independent archive review and written corrections to the foundation's origin materials. A senior staff member asked whether the communications office should suspend the documentary rollout immediately. Someone else requested that the donor wall remain dark until the record was corrected instead of being relit with another half-truth. A younger program manager, voice shaking but steady enough, said the staff needed written guidance by morning because nobody wanted to spend another week repeating a lie that had just collapsed in public. None of that restored the years I had lost, but it mattered because it made accountability operational instead of sentimental. Later, when I stepped out into the night with the archive case in my hand, the city felt quieter than it had after the gala. Not kinder, not magically repaired, just cleaner, because the lie had finally been forced into daylight where it could not keep breeding inside closed rooms. I did not go back to the estate. I did not return to the donor wall or the private dining room where my place had once been assigned for me. I did not wait to see whether anyone from the family would chase me into the street with a softer version of the same old bargain. I went home, opened the oldest journal to the first page, and wrote one new line beneath the original date. Tonight they learned that removal is not the same as disappearance. That sentence slowed my breathing and steadied my pulse. It did not pretend the week had been fair. It did not pretend exposure erased pain. What it gave me was something better than reconciliation. It gave me a visible end to the old arrangement. My family had built its polished public story on the assumption that I would always choose endurance over exposure. That assumption was gone now. They could still protect themselves in 100 small ways. They could still whisper, regroup, revise, and perform regret for rooms that had not seen the evidence. But they could no longer pretend I had agreed to disappear. The name on the wall mattered. The record mattered. The witnesses mattered. Yet the deepest justice was simpler than any of that. I left the theater as the person they could no longer reduce. And for the first time in years, that was enough to make the future feel like mine.